In this video, we'll take a look at using Int Flag to check to see if the user has canceled a dialog that they're in. So let's go ahead and run this little construct program again. And we can see, as in the prior videos, that when we choose query, we are in the construct mode, or the statement that's allowing us to do query by example. Now, the user has two options here: to accept or press the OK button, or to cancel. And if they cancel, we are returning them back to the menu to make another selection. Now, in this code, we have the use of something called Int Flag Checking, which is simply checking for an interrupt when the user was in the dialog. So we've gone into the query. Now we're exiting the query, and when we hit cancel, that provided information to the built-in variable called Int Flag that is then set to true, and allows us to check Int Flag to see if indeed they canceled out. So let's take a look at the code that handles that. So here we are in the ending the construct statement here, and the very next thing that we do is to check Int Flag. And you'll see this repeatedly when you're working with interactive dialog statements. You always want to check Int Flag to see if the user interrupted while they were in the interactive dialog. So again, in an input array, those types of statements as you learned in the interactive dialogs video. So if Int Flag is true, we could also evaluate it that way. That would be fine as well. So if Int Flag is true, so in other words, this variable has been set to true or set to 1, we're going to go ahead and set it to false. In other words, we are manually programming that we have checked it, we're setting it to false. If it was true, we want to go ahead and clear the form, and we're setting a message to the user and going on our way. Now, if it is not true, in other words, they did not cancel out, then we're going to go ahead and continue with our code that is letting us go and retrieve the rows. So they're in the construct, or they're in the input, or they're in an input array, for example, and they've canceled. We're able to check for that by checking the value of Int Flag. Now, again, it's very important to recognize with Int Flag that you are responsible as a programmer to set it to false after you've checked it. So if it's been set to true, you want to set it to false before continuing, so that you can trap it accurately the next time you enter into a dialog. And in some code, you'll see before going into the dialog a setting of Int Flag to false, just to be sure that it's not inadvertently set to true prior to entering the dialog. Now, it's also important to recognize that the cancel action in a dialog is not the only way that the Int Flag is set. It is also set when an interrupt signal is received, and an interrupt signal would be in a text user interface would be the Control-C, or here in a graphical user interface, if we bring up another little program, this program has an interrupt action associated with a button. And notice that we're not in an interactive dialog. Here we're just going to start a report. So we're starting sort of a one-way stream of information. If the user needs to interrupt that, we would have to send an interrupt signal, which we would do by using the predefined action interrupt. So when an interrupt is received by the system, Int Flag is set to true, and we can use our Int Flag processing as well. So here we ran or started the report, we pressed the interrupt, and you can see our message, the report has been canceled. Again, we're not in an interactive dialog statement. We don't have the OK and cancel option. Instead, we are providing a way for the user to force the interrupt of the report. So if we look at the code, one of the things that we have to be aware of is the keywords defer interrupt. What defer interrupt says is if an interrupt signal is received, to defer the processing to the code. In other words, don't just stop the program, but instead keep the program running and defer to the code on what it is to do. Now, to understand the use of the keywords defer interrupt, let's go ahead and comment them out and see how the program runs without those words there. Defer interrupt is put into the main. Now when we start our program and we hit interrupt, we've started the report processing, notice that we get the program stops and we get a status that the Genero runner has failed. So the program has just completely stopped and we get a message in our output there. Now when we uncomment those or include the defer interrupt, we start the report, we interrupt, and the program continues. And so what was checked was int flag. Int flag was set to true, and so we can see that we specify a report canceled information to the user. So let's take a look at the int flag code that we've included in here. So in our report function, one of the first thing that happens is to set int flag to false. Again, that's just confirming that int flag is set to false before we go into any processing where we might be checking for int flag. Then in this code, we start the report and we go into a for each loop. And we check in the for each loop whether or not int flag has been set to true, and that exits us out of the for each loop. Then we check again. If it was true, we're going to give that message to the user that the report was canceled. And if we've exited the for each loop and we have not received information that int flag was set to true, in other words, it's false, we're just going to go ahead and display that the report was finished and issue the finished report statement there. So when working with int flag related to an interrupt signal, we can use the same sort of int flag code processing as you saw with Dialogs, but we have to include those words defer interrupt in order to tell the program that we're going to handle the interrupt information.